turn the program over to Sarah Cohen, Director of Jewish National Fund's Speakers Bureau.
Great. Hi, thank you, Dan, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining us this evening to discuss 3,000 years of Zionism, concisely, of course, in one night. It's an honor to introduce Steven Shalowitz. Steven is the host of Jewish National Fund's IsraelCast podcast. And for more than 8 years, he has produced and hosted the One-Way Ticket Show podcast, where he explores with fascinating people where they'd go if given a one-way ticket, no coming back, past, present, future, real or imaginary. He's also a JNF New York board member and on JNF's social media committee, and invites you to connect with him on all social media at Steven Shalowitz. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to a best-selling author and a leading voice in advocacy for Australia's Jewish community. He's an accomplished academic who writes for leading publications and speaks around the world on the Arab-Israeli conflict, foreign and national affairs, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. He's a passionate advocate for Australia's Jewish community and is co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. He's a proud Zionist and has served as a spokesman for the Zionist Federation UK and was awarded a prestigious Israel Research Fellowship. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alex Ryvchin. Steven and Alex, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. I now turn the program over to the both of you.
Well, thanks very much for that, Sarah. And Alex, it's great to see you and to speak with you again. And before we get started, just a little housekeeping, really. First of all, in our last session, we had the book Becoming Israeli by 𝘡𝘪𝘰𝘯𝘪𝘴𝘮, and many of you contributed your Only in Israel moments, your Only in Israel stories to us, and we really appreciate that. And if you have any more your Only in Israel stories that you'd like to share, please do share them with us. We're going to be doing something grand with them, and you can send them into Sarah Cohen, and she's going to be putting her email address into the chat. So we would love to hear from you. Also, I want you to stick around because we actually not only have another book left in our fall reading series, but we also have our first quarter winter, shall we say, reading series that has been finalized. We're very excited about the books, and I'll be sharing with you what those books are at the end of our conversation with Alex. But in the meantime, really, again, Alex, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Good morning to you. It's evening time for us right now, and we want to thank you for joining us and for writing the book, Zionism, The Concise History. I devoured it. You were our recent guest on the IsraelCast podcast. The previous episode, we uploaded an episode today. So you're the previous episode, so everybody can check that out. We had a very lengthy conversation. And when I was thinking about our conversation today, I thought, how do we make this even more concise, for example, and do this in about 40-ish, 35 minutes. And so we're going to do our level best. So once again, thanks for joining us. And I really want to get started, Alex, with some definitions. If you can just define for us what Zionism is, and then your own personal take on that definition, given your personal history.
Firstly, it's a great pleasure to see you again, Stephen, and to be with JNF once more. To define Zionism in its most basic, simplest form is the support for belief in the right of the Jewish people to have self-determination in some part of our ancestral homeland. That's effectively what Zionism is and what it represents. It emerges in its modern form as we understand it today in the late 19th century, and it had the specific aim of ingathering the Jews from around the world to which they'd been exiled and scattered, and gathering them into a single national political entity through which they could determine their own political status and protect and safeguard the things that make our people distinct. But when you want to truly understand Zionism, you have to look at its component parts, where the movement came from, why it was so successful, and what are its underpinnings. And really, Zionism is about a conception of the Jews as a distinct people with a right to self-determination. And it's about the Jews having a connection to their ancestral lands. They're the really core components of Zionism. For me personally, having come from the Soviet Union, where my people were denied basic human rights there, you know, Zionism is also about Jewish resilience. It's about Jewish strength. It's about the unity of the Jewish people. And it's about, fundamentally, it's about Jewish rights. You know, throughout our history, we've been denied basic rights afforded to other peoples. And Zionism is about asserting, claiming, and safeguarding those rights for the Jewish people.
And so this notion of Zionism from a historical perspective dates back thousands of years since the exile, really.
That's right. And if you really want to understand Zionism, and so many modern expositions on Zionism kind of begin in the late 19th century with the writings of prominent people like Leon Pinsker and Herzl and so forth. But the story is really grounded in the history of the Jewish people and our origins as a people in the land. And that really is a crucial starting point for many reasons. Firstly, to understand Zionism in its truest sense, but also to debunk a lot of the anti-Zionist nonsense that we hear today about Zionism being an imperialist or colonialist movement. If you understand that the Jews had a national home, a national self-determination in that land 3,000 years ago, it completely undermines all of those specious arguments.
And Alex, can you walk us through some of the seminal moments, shall we say, in the history of Zionism? I know it's a rather daunting task because we're dealing with several thousand years in a few minutes, but just some of those key moments. And then I'd like to talk about some of the players within that time frame.
It is a daunting ask, but I'm up to it.
But you're up to the task, Alex.
I am. Anything you throw at me, I'm up to.
Yes.
Look, I think, as I said, it has to begin in the origins of the Jewish people in the land, in the establishment of the Jewish kingdoms, and a single united Jewish commonwealth. And then we have to move to the loss of that land through the conquest by the Romans, first in the year 70, and then the final expulsion under Hadrian in the year 135 CE. And from that point, the Jews move into an exile. Going back before that, even when you have the Babylonian exile, from that point of time, the Jews really begin to be a diaspora people. In addition to having their temple, which they return to and rebuild, and having a national home there, the majority of Jews after the Babylonian exile until modern times will live outside the land of Israel. So you have these dual streams in the Jewish experience, one stream living in the land and the other living in the diaspora, which really continues to this day. And then you kind of move forward and you have hundreds and hundreds of years, millennia of this experience, this kaleidoscope of suffering and upheaval and movement and periods of hope and periods of false hopes and false dawns and horror and destruction on a scale incomprehensible. And it's really from that misery and that pain and that dislocation and that desire to go home and that desire to achieve equality that Zionism then emerges in a coherent modern political form in the late 19th century, really stemming from the great writers in Russia and then moving westward. And then you have key moments, you have the emergence of Theodor Herzl through the Dreyfus Affair, the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, which articulates the specific aim of the Zionist movement. And then you have moments like the Balfour Declaration, which is the first international recognition of the validity of Zionism and the rights of the Jews to a national home. You have moments like the League of Nations mandate. And then you move through to the more modern period post the Holocaust with the founding of the state, which was on the basis of the UN resolution in the previous November, which favored 2 states for 2 people. So that's a very quick sweep across the 3,000-year history.
I know you're up to the task, Alex.
Anytime. But it really, just to re-emphasize, it really begins at the beginning. The story has to be understood through the prism of the Jews being a people and having a home in the land and then seeking to restore it. And that's what makes Zionism so successful and so extraordinary.
And there are 2 points coming out of there that I want to tick off. And the first is this notion that during the exile and before the state of Israel was established, there was always this notion of being a part of the people, a part of the community, as you point out in the book, but also separate from the community in many ways. And I'm wondering if you can address that.
So the great conundrum that faced the Jewish people from the time of the Babylonian exile until modern times, it's something that we all face now living in the diaspora, is how do we become good citizens, integrated, have contented, successful lives in the countries where we live, while still remaining Jews, remaining a distinct people and remembering who we are and where we came from. And it's a tension that the Jews have struggled with and all people struggle with. But I think we have really mastered that art of remaining distinct, but being immersed and integrated into the societies where we live. And that really comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who wrote to the Jewish elders in Babylon. They sought guidance about what they're supposed to do in the state of exile. And he said to them, pray for the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, for in its welfare you will find your own. And that simple statement really encapsulates the notion of good citizenry. You know, concern yourself with the affairs of the country where you live, contribute to its welfare, and you will find your welfare in that. But Jeremiah also said, you will return to your land. So that kind of encapsulates this dual notion of being good citizens in the places where they live, but also remembering that there's a home to go back to and to resurrect and to always remember. So it's something that the Jews have always grappled with, I think, to great success.
And the second point that I want to tick off there, based on your sweeping, concise version of the history of Zionism, is really this notion that there were always Jews in what is today the land of Israel. There was always a Jewish presence. And I think, as you point out in the book, in fact, Jerusalem itself in 1948 was predominantly Jewish. But you also had communities all throughout the land, even during the Ottoman Empire and so on. And can you talk about that as well, in busting that myth that, again, Israel is this creation of European Jewry?
It's a really critical point, and I'm glad you picked up on it, because one thing that the Jews have is an unbroken physical and spiritual and historical connection to the land, which can't be denied. And it's backed up by irrefutable archaeological and historical evidence. So I mentioned in 135 CE, Hadrian's expulsion of the Jews. He also prohibits entry of Jews into Jerusalem on pain of death. He destroys, the temple had been destroyed, but he erects a pagan temple on the ruins of the Jewish temple. He renames Jerusalem Alea Capitolina, and he renames Judea Syria Palestina. But still, even despite these prohibitions, Jews continue to live in places like Tiberias and Sfat and throughout the Galilee region. After the death of Hadrian, and once these prohibitions began to kind of slip and weren't enforced as strictly, Jews began to return to Jerusalem. And there are accounts in the book that I give of travelers from the Western world seeing these poor, wretched beggars coming and wailing and crying at the ruins of the temple, you know, in the Middle Ages or in the early years of post the exile of the Jews. So the Jews, despite enormous challenges, despite the occupation of their land and the colonization of their land by successive empires, they somehow found a way to remain there, to retain communities there, and even return to Jerusalem whenever they could.
There's a beautiful quote that you have in the book here, Alex, that I want to read, and I want you to respond to it. And it's on page 29. I'm sure you remember writing this. And it goes, quote, "As with all peoples dispossessed of their indigenous lands, where the ability to live on the land itself is lost, the connection to land is maintained by integrating it into the culture, ritual, and storytelling of the people, generation to generation." And for me, that was actually very powerful, because when I think of Pesach, when I think of all the other Chagim, we've just come out of Sukkot, we had Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, even on Shabbat, for example. That's really what we do, don't we? And we have throughout the generations.
That's right. And it's partly a reflection of the fact that our stories and our history and our traditions were created in that land. So naturally, they run through and they permeate through all of our traditions, but also, as you point out, it's a practical way, it's the effective way of retaining that spiritual and emotional connection and that memory of the land by integrating it into our liturgy, into all of our prayers and customs and traditions. So you mentioned in Pesach, of course, we conclude the Seder by saying next year in Jerusalem, the Amidah, which is recited thrice daily by observant Jews. We talk about remembrance of Jerusalem, and Zion is mentioned 3 times as well. We remember the destruction of the temples on Tisha B'Av. So all of these things assisted the Jews in remembering where they came from, remembering who they are, remembering they're a distinct people. And while they should seek to live good, full, productive, inclusive lives in the cities where they've ended up, to still remember where they come from and to seek the restoration of that land, which has now been achieved.
There were a number of personalities that you referenced in the book, Alex, some of which I knew, some of which I did not. Some of them who are really wretched individuals. And I want to tick off a few of them. And if you can explain who they are, their backgrounds and their importance. And the first one is Khmelnytsky. And I had never heard of him before I read the book, dare I say. I've not been to the Ukraine yet, despite the fact that my paternal grandfather was born there outside of Kiev. So I would like to visit one day. But can you share with all those in the group this evening who he was and his role in how Jews remember him in the Ukraine today?
So Bogdan Khmelnytsky, it's a name that Ukrainian Jews, it immediately causes a shudder, anguish. And before the Jews experienced Nazism, there was Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and he occupied that central figure, that central place in the mentality of the Russian Jews, the Ukrainian Jews, as being the arch evil. And basically, he was a nationalist figure in the mid-17th century who led a Cossack rebellion against Polish rule. And he's revered for that amongst Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. So you go to the city of Kiev, where I was born, and you'll see huge monuments to Khmelnytsky on horseback. He's really revered as a national figure there because he did fight for the liberation and the independence of Ukraine. But as part of that struggle for independence, as so often happens in the history of the Jewish people, there was extraordinary barbarism and bloodletting and cruelty. And an estimated 100,000, some estimates place the number something far higher than that, Jews living peacefully in villages and towns throughout that land were massacred in the most gruesome, despicable, horrific ways imaginable. And I speak about it in this book. And one of the most challenging decisions for me was whether to include some of that graphic detail about how these massacres were carried out. And in the end, I felt that I can't censor this history. People need to understand, and to hear numbers recited and statistics doesn't really make the point. People need to know exactly what the Jews were subjected to. And I inserted this story about Khmelnytsky, not merely for the sake of, encouraging literacy and awareness and knowledge, but it really is central to the story of Zionism, because when we talk about Jewish liberation and emancipation, it is from Khmelnytsky and his successors that we were seeking that emancipation and liberation. And Khmelnytsky had this profound impact on the psyche of Russian and Soviet and Ukrainian Jews ever since. The pogrom is a legacy of Khmelnytsky. And it's no wonder that people like Leon Pinsker, who emerged in Odessa, people like Chaim Weizmann, who came about in Belarusia, that the great early thinkers and the writers in Zionism, and also the community organizing that took place, really happened there. It can all be traced to the barbarism and the cruelty of Khmelnytsky and the things that followed thereafter. And another point that I made in the book is that, when people would then look at the war crimes committed during the Holocaust and wonder how these things could happen, how neighbor could turn on neighbor, how the Jews of Kiev were simply rounded up and massacred in a ravine in the city of Kiev at Babi Yar, how these things could occur. The answer again lies in Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He had prepared the people generation on generation to accept that Jewish blood was cheap, and these sorts of massacres in the name of liberation or whatever cause that they were fighting for was something tolerable and legitimate.
Right. Another really horrific person, and then we'll get on to some positive people, was of course Haj Amin al-Husseini. You wrote about him. Others have written about him. So those that are joining us in the book group tonight might be familiar with him. If you can just in broad brushstrokes share his role in the story of Zionism, really.
So again, Haj Amin al-Husseini is a great villain in the story of Zionism, but it's really important to understand him and to understand him as really the patron, the founder of the Palestinian national movement, as the man who so successfully fused Arab nationalism and the notions of Islamic supremacism and turned opposition to the Jews and Zionism into effectively an Islamic duty. And the other reason why I felt that it was so important to talk about him, he's not only his story and his interventions are not only peppered throughout the story of Zionism, but so much is said and written about Haj Amin al-Husseini in modern times. Sometimes his role is exaggerated and often it's diminished. And I felt it was important to set the record straight about what he did and what he didn't do. So Haj Amin al-Husseini emerges in about 1920, around that period. He's a young man and he's from a noble family, a prestigious family in Jerusalem. And he becomes active in agitating a riot called the Nebi Musa riots, which began as a street parade and turned bloody. There were shouts of the Jews are our dogs and attacks on Jewish shopkeepers and so forth. And that's really al-Husseini's emergence. He then comes back and attains the position of Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And throughout the 20s and 30s, when the British are trying to remain true to their legal obligations to grant the Jews a state in the land and facilitate Jewish migration as pledged under the San Remo Accords and the League of Nations Covenant and the Balfour Declaration before it, al-Husseini is the man who leads the opposition to that at every single turn. So in 1937, when the Peel Commission is brought together to determine how to resolve the conflict in the land, al-Husseini is unflinching, unremitting in saying, no, 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 no Jewish migration in the land, no Jewish population in any Arab Palestinian state, no land purchases by Jews, and absolutely no Jewish state in any borders whatsoever. And then when the war begins, al-Husseini sees an opportunity. He's smuggled into Germany by the Italians. He spends the war in Berlin on a very wealthy, healthy pension by Hitler, and he makes broadcasts in Arabic to the Islamic world, beckoning them to war with the Jews. He then travels to Bosnia, where he briefs and meets SS soldiers from the Waffen SS from Bosnia, encourages them to wage war and commit atrocities against the Jews. And there was one particularly horrific intervention, direct intervention, which he made when the Red Cross had successfully brokered an exchange of Jewish orphans from Poland in exchange for captured Nazi soldiers, high-ranking officials. And the exchange was set to go through and the Jewish children were set to be liberated. When al-Husseini caught wind of this and he thought that the Jews would end up in Palestine, he then thwarted this deal and the Jews were then sent to Auschwitz where they were gassed on the day of their arrival. So all throughout the story of Zionism, you have this sinister figure who is really leading to great loss and suffering for the Jews and also for the Palestinians, because his mentality has really spawned Palestinian rejectionism, which has kept them stateless to this very day. And truly, al-Husseini should be remembered as a Nazi collaborator. He should have really suffered the same fate as other Nazi collaborators, which is either a war crime or swinging in a public square. But he's revered as a towering figure in the Islamic world, as a figure of resistance. And sadly, he never faced the justice he deserved.
Well, let's turn to something a little bit more positive. And before we get to Theodore Herzl, because we can't talk about Zionism without talking about Theodore Herzl. So we're going to put him on pause for a second. I want you to talk about the British officer, John, I wrote his name down here because I can't remember anything these days. The British officer, John Henry Patterson, and his relationship to the Netanyahu family. I did not know this story, Alex, before I read your book.
Look, it's a hell of a story. And one of the great joys of researching and writing this book is finding all these moments and coincidences that show you that this story was inspired by something.
Did you know who he was before you did the research?
I did. I was aware of him and I knew broadly the story, but the Netanyahu connection I wasn't aware of. And that really it was a gem to find, and I was delighted to find it.
And I'd like also those that are joining us here in the group to weigh in on the chat if they know about this story or not. So carry on with the story, because I thought I was the only one that didn't know about it.
So basically in 1914 in Palestine, this is a few years before the fall of the Ottoman Empire and it passes into British hands. And under pressure from the local Arabs, the Ottoman authorities deport 18,000 Jews, which they thought were organizing into a political movement. And of those 18,000 Jews, 14,000 would end up in the Egyptian port city of Alexandria, where there was a very old Jewish community and they were taken in and embraced by that community. And two of those exiled Jews will be known to many of your listeners, towering figures in the Zionist movement, Zev Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor. And by, again, serendipity and coincidence, soon the British forces and the Anzac, the Australian and New Zealand forces, would arrive by convoy via the Suez Canal and land in Alexandria as well. And there, Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor would impress upon the British soldiers the benefits of forming a Jewish fighting force to fight alongside the Allies and the British for the liberation of Palestine. And that unit was formed and it was called the Zion Mule Corps. And it was the first regular Jewish fighting force since the Jewish rebellion against Hadrian in 135 CE. So it's historic from that point of view as well. And it's placed under the command of a British officer, John Henry Patterson, who you mentioned. And Patterson knew nothing, he'd never met a Jew before, knew nothing of Zionism, but he had a certain, I suppose, stereotypical view of Jews as being bookish and weaklings. And then he sees these proud, strong, fighting Jews. He becomes a lifelong devotee to the Zionist cause. And then the great Israeli historian, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who is the father of Benjamin Netanyahu, would name his first son, Yonatan. Of course, he's the hero of the operation in Entebbe, after John Henry Patterson, who had become this great figure in the Zionist movement. So It's just a remarkable story about all these events happening, the expulsion of the Jews to Alexandria, the arrival of the British, the forming of the Zion Mule Corps, and suddenly this connection to the Netanyahus. It's just indicative of the wonder of the story of Zionism, truly.
As they say, Alex, you can't make this stuff up.
Indeed.
Right. Okay, so 𝘡𝘪𝘰 𝘪𝘴. I think most people that are joining us in this book group probably know about 𝘡𝘪𝘰 𝘪𝘴. So my question really to you, Alex, is that when you were doing the research, or even before or after for that matter, was there anything that you particularly found that you didn't know about 𝘡𝘪𝘰 𝘪𝘴 from before? Were there any nuggets, any new information? Anything that would surprise us, anything that surprised you, for example? Because I think we all know about the story, but is there anything new and fresh when it comes to 𝘡𝘪𝘰 𝘪𝘴?
I think there's, as you said, most people know of Herzl, of course, and the Dreyfus Affair. And I think there's a view that Herzl was completely uninitiated in Jewish affairs. He went to see the Dreyfus trials as a journalist and had this eureka moment, this great awakening. And in a sense, that's true. The Dreyfus Affair did have a profound impact on Herzl. Within 6 months of the trial, he would pen the first draft of the Jewish State, which is the seminal text of Zionism. Within a couple of years, he would convene the first Zionist Congress in Basel. So the Dreyfus Affair launched Herzl into his most productive and important period of work. But he was, for a long time before that, deeply involved in and engaged in contemplating the Jewish question. How do we alleviate the suffering of the Jews? But his conclusions were probably surprising to many people. He argued for absolute assimilation. Later on, he became the figurehead of the national movement, a separatist movement. But for a long time, he believed in complete assimilation, to the extent that, he said the Jews should disappear into the crowd. And he even for a while argued for a mass conversion of Jews to Christianity. So convinced was he that by adopting the norms and the ways of the majority population in Europe, he thought that was the way to salvation for the Jews. So the Dreyfus Affair totally changes his thinking, makes him realize that if someone like Dreyfus, who is the epitome of integration and assimilation, a loyal soldier in the French army, if he can be dragged out of the crowd and humiliated and have a mob of Frenchmen chanting death to Dreyfus and death to the Jews outside his trial, no Jew is safe no matter how assimilated. So that was, I think, important. The other thing that I found about Herzl, we all knew of Herzl as this grand, towering figure, the way he dressed, the way he presented. He gave these searing speeches which really ignited the Jewish masses throughout the world, particularly amongst the poor in places like London's East End. We know about his diplomacy with the Kaiser and with the Sultan and with the Russians as well, and the British. But one thing that I discovered was that he was a brilliant grassroots organizer. And despite being a very important man, despite being a leader of an important movement, and despite being very, very busy and tireless in what he did, he was never too good or too important for the menial tasks. So I read about him, before the first Zionist Congress, sitting up with students late into the night, addressing envelopes to the people who would attend. He oversaw every single detail. And I think there's a lesson in that, because it shows us that grand speeches and books are very important to swaying public opinion and building movements. But you can't be too big for the simple stuff either. That grassroots organizing, connecting with the people you're seeking to lead, is really important to the success of a movement as well. So I think that's something that I took from my research, and maybe we can all take from the story of Herzl and Zionism and apply to the movements we're involved in.
Speaking of movements, and again, I just want to highlight for everybody that's joining us this evening that you were our guest on the previous episode of IsraelCast, the podcast. We talk at length about the subject of Zionism. The one question that I didn't ask you, though, that we didn't have enough time, we ended up going on that interview for about an hour or so, but there was one question, and that's this notion of Zionism and Africa, right? And this notion of how the early Zionists really wanted to help liberate the peoples of Africa as well.
So Africa has always kind of played this unusual part in the story of Zionism, in the sense that before it was determined by the Zionist Congress that Zionism had to be realized in the land of Israel, that there could be no Jewish state outside that area. Herzl himself and a lot of people within the Zionist movement were open to contemplating a Jewish state in other territories. For example, in what's called Uganda, but it was really the Kenyan foothills. there was talk of that, but it was only after Herzl's death that the Zionist Congress finally resolved that there could be no Zionism without Zion. That's where the land had to be situated. And then when you move forward post the creation of the state, the Zionists, and pre it as well, the Zionists and the fighters in the land, the Yishuv, were really seen as being the comrades of freedom fighters and liberation movements throughout the world. And one of the great ironies is that those kind of on the hard left, those who are part of resistance movements or independence movement today, we associate as being hostile to Zionism in the state of Israel. But pre-state and in the early years of the state, they very much viewed the Zionists as being freedom fighters trying to throw off colonialism and throw off empires. And so the Jews were seen as being the brethren of the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, for example. There's this episode which I talked about in the book, another one of these great little nuggets where Ben-Gurion flees to Paris to escape arrest by the British authorities in Palestine. He happens to meet Ho Chi Minh in a hotel in Paris, and Ho Chi Minh offers the Jews stayed in exile in Vietnam. You know, these just ridiculous, remarkable stories. It sounds like an anecdote, you know, about Ho Chi Minh and Ben-Gurion, but it actually happened. But it really shows, and maybe we'll talk about more about this when we talk about anti-Zionism, but it shows this complete revolution, this complete shift, whereas revolutionaries and freedom fighters and independence movement viewed the Jews as liberators and comrades, and now they view them in a whole different sense.
Right, and we have just about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I want to just let everybody that know that's joining us on the call. Alex has very kindly agreed to stay a little bit after school to chat with us, but I want to ask you about anti-Zionism. I'm glad you brought it up because that's really where I wanted to go right now. When did it become fashionable to become an anti-Zionist? And how would you suggest people counter those anti-Zionist provocateurs?
Well, the story of anti-Zionism is a really interesting one, a really important one. And that's why I devoted a complete chapter to it, the final chapter of the book, to understanding it, because it's important to understand it also to equip people today to counter it and to fight it. They need to know where it came from, its hypocrisy and its evolution. Basically, for as long as the Jews had a Zionist movement, there has been a stream running in parallel with it, seeking to thwart their aims. And it's been made up of different groups and different actors at various times. So we spoke about Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had his motives. There were US State Department officials who were staunchly anti-Zionist because they believed, some of them were driven by maybe Christian prejudice against the Jews. Others believed it was against the US national interest to get too close to the Jews when the Arabs were seen as being of vastly greater strategic importance. There were numerous reasons why people were drawn to the cause of anti-Zionism. And also within the Jewish world, there were streams of Jews in the Reform movement and elsewhere amongst assimilated, well-integrated Jews who believed, like Herzl first believed, that assimilation was the key rather than a national movement. Mm-hmm. But things really change as history moves along. And when you have the Holocaust, which proves the notion that the Jews require a national home to secure their survival and makes mockery of any notion that the Jews could achieve their liberation and survival merely by being good, loyal citizens, which they were throughout the Europe that slaughtered them. That really causes a change in Zionism and anti-Zionism, and all honorable people really desert the ranks of anti-Zionism at that point. And the creation of the State of Israel causes another shift, because no longer is anti-Zionism the opposition to an idea, to a political concept. It becomes the opposition to a state in fact, and one that to this day has now existed for over 70 years. But the major point, and I talk about this in length in the book, is the role of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, despite initially favoring the creation of a Jewish state, I extract the speech of Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet ambassador to the UN, at length, because again, I think it's very important to show Soviet support for a Jewish national home. But in the 1950s, that really turns in a dramatic way. Israel becomes more Western, it becomes friendlier with the United States, it becomes more of an ally to the British and to the French after the Suez Crisis. And the Soviet Union, with its unrivaled capacity for propaganda, with its deep basis, deep well of anti-Jewish prejudice, turns in a complete way against Zionism and the Jewish state. I talk about also the origins of the Zionism as racism resolution in 1975 in the United Nations, which again has Soviet fingerprints all over it. And really, the role of the Soviet Union was to then spread that anti-Zionist message, to smear Zionism as imperialism, as akin to Nazism even. That all stems from there. And it now finds its home on university campuses, on the vestiges of far-left movements throughout the world, human rights organizations. So when we look at modern anti-Zionism and the rhetoric that we see, it has a long record and a long history, which really stems from Soviet anti-Zionism / anti-Semitism.
In this notion, people say, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. And Alex says,
well, it really, I'd say it's a nonsense, because when you look at what Zionism is, when you look at what anti-Zionism stands for and what it represents, you can intellectually argue there's a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, sure. But in a practical sense, in a real life sense, that distinction has become so blurred and inconsequential. And those people who are committed anti-Zionists invariably either oppose Jewish liberation and Jewish rights. It's steeped in a denial of Jewish peoplehood and connection to land, which is itself anti-Semitic. And frequently they trade in classic anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. So what the Jew was historically, bloodthirsty, killing women and children, controlling the levers of power, finance, the media, the governments, all those things, malevolent, the obstacle to a better, purer, more spiritual world, all the things that the Jew has been depicted as for millennia, the Zionist now is. And so it makes mockery of the notion that one can be anti-Zionist and have clean hands at the same time.
Right. I have a couple more questions that I wanted to ask you, and you're okay to stay on? I know you're just starting your day there in Sydney. It looks like you have a sunny day there.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but happy to stay with you for as long as you like.
Okay, Steve. Very good, because we still have a very robust group here. And I did want to get to a couple other questions. Please send us some sunshine, first of all. It was a very dreary, rainy, drizzly day here in New York City. So we do need a little bit of sunshine. When we talk about Zionism and we look at what's happening in Israel today and its relations with its Gulf neighbors, I think it's fascinating. And we look at what's happening, especially with what just happened with its relationship with Sudan. And we all know about the Khartoum conference and what happened there. So can you talk about the winds of change that are taking place throughout the Gulf and throughout the Arab world, and then relay that vis-a-vis Zionism?
Well, firstly, I think we need to pause and acknowledge that what is happening now with Sudan and the UAE and Bahrain is truly historic. And often it's difficult to acknowledge when you live through something historic. It's only in hindsight that you acknowledge it as being a moment of great significance. But truly the fact that in our days we're seeing what can really be termed as the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. No longer is this a conflict between Israel, tiny Israel, and the Arab world. The Arab world has gone from a position of apathy towards the cause and towards conflict with Israel to actual friendship and partnership with Israel. And that is something truly extraordinary, and we have to cherish it. But it's significant also, as you point out, in the story of Zionism, because when you look at what Zionism sought to achieve, when you look at the words of the Basel Declaration, which spoke about a Jewish state secured under public law, which meant international recognition of its legitimacy, when you look at Israel's Declaration of Independence, which talks about Israel living at peace with the Arab world and all the peoples of the region, what we're seeing now is a fulfillment of the Zionist vision of Israel living in peace and security and strength, but at peace and in partnership and in fraternity with the Arab peoples of the region. It's something that the framers of Zionism always dreamed of and envisaged, and it's happening now. And when you contrast it with, say, 1948, and 47, when in response to the UN partition plan, one Arab state after another mounted the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, denounced Zionism, denounced Israel, declared its intentions to effectively go to war, and then we see the war in the ensuing year. And now to have countries making peace with Israel, and in doing so, acknowledging the legitimacy of Zionism, it's an extraordinary thing. It's a huge turnaround, and it should all give us incredible hope that no matter how bleak things may seem, things can turn around and peace can be attained.
Alex, before I get on to another question, I just have to give you a shout out because Nina Sabir, I need new glasses. I got your name correct there, Nina, wrote, "This was the most significant book I read this year." Thank you. Oh,
that's lovely.
And for all of you that don't have the book yet, this is what it looks like, and I really suggest you get it. And also, I think that kids need to read the book because this really will help them to understand what Zionism is all about. Again, the history of Zionism, as the name suggests, so that they can combat those people that try and erase this story of Zionism or try and pollute it or cloud it with their own biases. And that's really where I want to go right now. How should people respond to those provocateurs, whether it's on social media or on college campuses, that say all of the awful, horrid things that they're saying about Israel and about Zionism?
Look, it has to begin with knowing our own story. And I'm grateful to you, Stephen, for encouraging young people to read the book, because really it's one of my core aims with this book. You know, I see in my work and my engagement with Jewish communities around the world, our own young people, including those who have come through Jewish day schools, are often ignorant of the story of Zionism. And these are the people that we expect to carry the torch and to also lead the fight on university campuses and political parties and in other forums in the next generation. And so it begins with knowing the story. And if you know the story of Zionism, if you know the story of the Jews being a people of the land and having self-determination in that land, it's the only land in which we were a people. It's the only land in which we had self-determination. Then this idea that Zionism is a colonial movement, that we have no roots in the land, that we stole someone else's land, these arguments can't stand up. And so I'm often asked for some talking points about combating the apartheid myth or about ethnic cleansing and genocide. I'm not a believer in talking points. I'm a believer in having conversations with people and debunking arguments in a cerebral way. I think that's the way it's done. And there's no substitute for knowledge. And so I hope that people will read this book and have that knowledge. And as I said, if you know that story, there is no argument that can be put at us that can't be combated. When Linda Sarsour says that Zionism is incompatible with feminism, we all know on an emotional level that that's nonsense. But if you know the story of Zionism, you can demolish her in a moment. And likewise with any anti-Zionist. It's a movement of national liberation. It is the most extraordinarily successful movement, perhaps of modern times, when you have a people losing their land, retaining their sense of peoplehood, and returning to reclaim their self-determination. It's something unprecedented in human history. And it's something that should inspire people and unify people all around the world.
So Alex, when I was reading the book, and I think I might have mentioned this during our podcast interview, it really astonished me when you think about the story of the Jewish people. I mean, of course, being Jewish, it's sometimes difficult to take a step back and look at the story. But when you think about the story, all of the pogroms, the massacres, the expulsions, the Holocaust, the persecution, but yet the Jewish people are still standing and Israel still exists. And for me, when I think about Israel today, and I want you to respond to this and share your perspective because you've spent a lot of time in Israel, it's really a gift, isn't it? And when I think about, for example, my grandfathers, one came from Northeast Poland, the other came from, as I said, outside Kiev. They came to the United States with absolutely nothing. They became successful businessmen, very prominent in their fields, as well as giving back to the Jewish communities in Chicago, where I'm from. And I think to myself, when they were growing up in Europe, could they ever have imagined in their wildest dreams that there would be a state of Israel? Could their parents and their grandparents ever imagine? So what a gift it is to us to really be the shepherds for the land of Israel. I mean, it's really a dream come true. And I mean, I'm not trying to give an advertisement for JNF, but I mean, organizations like JNF are so powerful in terms of the work that they do, because it's truly, truly a gift, isn't it?
It's beautifully said, Stephen. And as I said earlier, it's often difficult to appreciate what you have in a period of time.
Yeah.
But the fact that you do acknowledge how extraordinary it is that we have Israel today, when in the span of human history and Jewish history, we've had a national home for a brief period of time, and to be living through it and to have a thriving Jewish state finding peace with its neighbors is something wonderful to be living through, truly. And the book, and particularly condensing it in such a way, this story, it is full of tragedy and misery and inquisitions and pogroms and slaughters in the Islamic world and in Europe and horrible things happening to the Jews and white papers and grand muftis and all of these things. And it's very easy to despair at the story and to think that the story of the Jewish people is one of calamity after calamity after calamity. But really, I think that when you look at what we've achieved, when you look at the things that were done in such an improbable way, the emergence of this movement in a compelling way, the diplomacy that took place, the organizing, the human endeavor and effort, and the outcomes of it, it should really inspire us. And one of the things that I want this book to do is to make Jewish people incredibly proud of the people they belong to, and understand that they belong to a people of incredible fortitude and genius that achieved something that no other people in human history have managed to achieve.
And I have to say also, there's a little bit of a hand of God in there as well, because you talk about, we really don't have enough time to go into the story of Chaim Weizmann, but I hope people pick up the book and read the real story behind Chaim Weizmann if they don't know it already, and his role in acetone and World War I and meeting the key players and the involvement that he had with the Balfour Declaration. I mean, again, as I say, you can't make this stuff up. It's a story of history, right? So one of the members that's joined us this evening wants to know, hi Maxine, she wants to know what's Alex's next book. And this is actually a nice segue because you actually have a book that I want you to show to our audience this evening.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. So this is a book that I wrote. It's called A New Day. And it's of a totally different type and a speed to Zionism, the Concise History, and my first book, The Anti-Israel Agenda. This book I wrote initially for my 3 daughters to help them cope with the anguish that the pandemic was causing them, the disruption to their lives, the loss of their school friends, and the inability to play with their friends and to see their grandparents, all the things that we're experiencing all around the world. And it was eventually published into a book, and it's become an international bestseller. And it's a story of hope and resilience and finding happiness in life's simple pleasures. And it assures children that no matter how bleak today may be, a new day, a better day will come. And I'm so grateful for the response I'm getting from teachers and parents all around the world. I'm getting notes saying that it's helped them, that they cry over the book every night. It's been incredibly gratifying. As I said, it's not something I planned to write, but I believe in the power of words and ideas, and I felt that this was the book for this time. So I hope your readers enjoyed as well.
And then what is your next Israel-focused book?
I've got a few things that I'm working on, both Israel and non-Israel focused, but my next Israel book, which I've started to kind of plan a little bit, is something which people have been asking me to do for a number of years, which is a book which debunks the top myths about Israel. So the top 10 myths about Israel, and it exposes them, it forensically kind of unpacks them, and it shows how to respond to them and why they're false. So I hope that will, again, as I said, I don't believe in talking points, but this will be more substantive than that. But it will really delve.
When do you expect that to come out? When do you expect it to come out?
Look, maybe in a year or two. I'll keep you posted.
No pressure, Alex. We'll have you back on. No pressure. And then what is the other book that you're working on?
So my other book, which is close to publication, is called Get Action. And it's another children's book, which profiles the lives of some of the greatest figures in history, Jewish and non-Jewish, and extracts the lessons from their lives that we can apply to our own, about, again, finding hope, about being a leader, all the great qualities that we need to lead successful and productive lives.
Great. Just really as we wind down our conversation, and before I share our books that we're going to be featuring, you can wake up early in the morning and join us, Alex, if you like, for our book club come January, come next month, actually, November and January. As you're doing the research for this book and all the other work that you've done, is there a historical figure or two that you would have wanted to have met, and what would you have wanted to have asked them?
That's a good question. I mean, a figure that I've always admired, who has no connection to Zionism or the Jewish national movement, is Teddy Roosevelt.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm very surprised to hear you say that. Is someone born in the Ukraine and living in Australia now with a passion for Israel?
Look, I look at Teddy Roosevelt's life and his achievements, and you asked me about my new book called Get Action, and that's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And the thing that I loved about Roosevelt was that everything he did in life was full of action. He believed, he had a certain mindset about throwing himself into challenges and adversity, overcoming difficult situations in his life. And I think he was a person of rare energy that we can learn from, about whatever it is that we seek to do in life. if we live our lives like Teddy Roosevelt, we'll live better for it. He's a remarkable figure.
An Israeli figure?
An Israeli figure. There are so many. I mean, I admire many of the prime ministers. Certainly, Yitzhak Rabin is a person that I'm thinking about now as we approach the 25th anniversary of his assassination. And this is a person who was a pioneer, who initially defended the state with the tower and stockade, who gave himself over to the state, and who fell by the hand of a fellow Jew, which is an immense tragedy and a moment of shame for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And I think there's a legacy to be learned, a lesson to be learned from his life about devotion, about national service, about civic duty. But also I think there's another lesson that we can all take away about, we get so overheated sometimes in our rhetoric, in our discussions, in our debates. And the ugly endpoint of that can be something like what happened with Yitzhak Rabin. So I think it's a word of caution to always tone down the rhetoric, to think about the impact of our words, whether they might incite people to do awful things. I think that's part of his legacy in a very sad way, but a meaningful way.
All right. Well, we do have one final question. Do you know much about how Theodore Roosevelt dealt with the SS St. Louis? And that comes from Linda, but that wasn't Theodore Roosevelt, that was FDR.
It was. So I believe I talk about the ships, or several ships, including the Exodus moment. So one of the really dark aspects of the Holocaust in that period of time was the way that many Western powers, including Canada, which was involved in the St. Louis and turning it away, and the British, the way they sabotaged ships, trying to take Jews to Palestine, fleeing the gas chambers, and the inactivity of European and world leaders and US leaders during that time. And it really goes back to the Evian Conference in 1938, which was convened at the request of FDR to work out what to do with this looming refugee crisis in Europe because of the displacement of the Jews that was coming from Nazi persecution. And Hitler sent an official to monitor these proceedings, and he effectively reported back to Hitler that there is such disinterest in the Jewish question, such a lack of care about what will happen to the Jews, you can effectively do what you will to them. And so we see the tragic consequences of nations shrugging their shoulders at the misfortune of others.
Listen, Alex, I'm super mindful of the clock. We were going to do this for about 40 minutes, and we're up to about an hour now, and our audience has stayed with us all throughout. So thank you to everybody that's joining us. Stay here, though, because I just want to share a couple of things. First of all, again, the book, Zionism, The Concise History. You can see some of the notes that I have here. Alex, the whole thing is just all full of notes. I had to take some of them out because they were all falling out. So in any event, once again, Zionism, The Concise History. And again, if you haven't read it, please do read it and share it around. Hanukkah's coming up. This makes an amazing Hanukkah gift. And kids that are in college, for example, or in high school that are on vacation, it's a super easy read. And it's one that really they should read. So really pick up a copy, everybody, of Zionism, The Concise History. And I also want to share our books. Alex, I think you might be interested. You're going to wake up early, I know, no doubt, and join us for our next book club selection, which is Joe Nathan's The Foods of Israel. The Foods of Israel Today. I always like to leave on a positive note.
I've got one of the books upstairs. That's great.
Are you a good cook, by the way?
The lockdown has made me a better cook by necessity.
Okay, we'll take that. That doesn't mean necessarily a good cook, but a better cook, or better than you were before, right? But one thing I love about this book, actually, and you're probably familiar with this, Alex, is that it's not only just recipes, but there are tons of stories, anecdotes. There's a lot of history. You're a history buff. I'm a history buff. There's a lot in here, and this is fascinating. And that's going to be November 18th. I'm looking at Sarah's notes here, 8 p.m. So that's whatever time in Sydney, Australia. And then I want to just share a couple of other book selections that we have here. The first one is Tu B'Shvat. It's on January 27th. It's a Wednesday. And we have Rabbi Yonat. So we're going to take December off, just because everyone's going to be in Hanukkah mode. Well, everyone's going to be reading Alex's book during Hanukkah time, right? So we're going to take off December. But in January 27th, we have a book called Eco Bible. It's by Rabbi Yonatan Nerel. And he is the director of the Interfaith Center for Sustainability in Jerusalem. And we're doing the episode on Tu B'Shvat. And it's he's fascinating. We interviewed him for IsraelCast. So we have that coming in January. February, I'm really excited about this one. It's called The Story of Hebrew by Professor Louis Glinert from Dartmouth. And actually one of our book club members had recommended that book. So we took up his recommendation, and Sarah contacted Professor Glinert at Dartmouth, and he's going to join us in February. In March, Alex, this is one you're going to enjoy as well, by David Nassau. It's called The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Peoples from World War to Cold War. It's a fascinating read. And then in April, we have the book Israelistan. I don't know if I can say this. It's Israel and Resilience. Israel Resilience. How's that? I can't say it. I'm going to have to learn how to.
Dixon. Yeah.
Yes, pardon me. Yes, Michael Dixon and Naomi Baum. I'm going to have to learn how to pronounce it. I know I'm going to read it, but I'll have to learn how to pronounce it beforehand. So we have those books lined up for January, February, March, and we're super excited about the selection because we really want to be able to share nuggets and aspects of Israel that you don't necessarily get anywhere else. And so that's what really part of our mission is here for this book series. So really with that, Alex, we want to thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for any final comments. And thank you all to everybody for joining us. We so appreciate your support here for this book group. We can't do it without you, and we're doing it for you and together with you. And if you have any suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. And once again, just thanks to everybody for joining us this evening or this morning, in your case, Alex, wherever you're coming to us from. So thanks a lot, and an early Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Alex. I think you wrapped it perfectly. Hope to see you all on November 18th with Joe Nathan. Have a great evening.
Take it easy.